And all that's good.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Casey. I'm the managing director at FP Analytics, which is the research division associated with Foreign Policy Magazine. And it is a real pleasure to be here this afternoon for this discussion of from territorial to functional sovereignty, competition in the digital age. We have a distinguished panel joining us in this conversation, starting with Jacques Bagoun, director of the McKinsey Global Institute. Um, Oh, I'm out of order here. Mathilde Menard, Deputy Director for Financial and Enterprise Affairs here at the OECD. Casper Klinge, Tech Ambassador from Denmark. And Nicholas Collin, author of Hedge, A Greater Safety Net for the Entrepreneurial Age. So we're here today to talk about digital platforms, their market power, and their potential challenge to some of the traditional functions and services of governments. I'll start out with a question just for the group. And you all have the BCast app on your phone, so feel free to put in questions throughout the session. I'll have them here on this iPad and share them with the group as they come in. But starting broadly, some argue that there hasn't been enough scrutiny of digital platforms that don't charge their users. Do you believe that there's still an issue of competition when consumers aren't paying for the service? And are there tools and antitrust toolkits that can take into account these new business models centered around the collection of data? Who would like to start? Yes, please. The OECD perspective.
Yeah. First, I mean, I would like to do two remarks. First, that it's not really new. We had already markets like that. Speaking about radio, television, or free press, etc. Of course, the scale, the scope is different now. You have out of the 10 biggest global companies, you have 7 of them that are in this kind of zero price market. So it's not new, but the scope is different. Second point, why you do have this zero price market is because the consumers, they give the data, they generate the data, they give them, and they focus their attention on advertisement also. So there is a reason why you have this new type of shape of markets. And at the OECD, we have looked at how the competition works in this type of market. And what we have found is that you don't have really legislative barriers to address misconduct in this new type of market, zero price markets. But you do need, I mean, the competition authorities, they need to adapt a little bit their tools sometimes. And for example, they usually use the prices as, you know, the data to do their quantitative analysis. So they might need to look at qualitative data instead. So, but you could still enforce competition law in these new types of markets, just adapting your tools. And the new thing really is that you need to cooperate. Not only, I mean, it's not only the competition authorities that are concerned with this new type of zero price markets. You need to have them working with their consumer protection authorities, their colleagues, and their data protection authorities together. So that's preliminary answer to your question.
Yeah, well, I guess I like the way you frame it. So let me frame my own way. I like your first point, which is it has been that way for a long time. In nature or in economics, we've got superstars. We got power law all over the place. And this time it seems like, platforms, digital platforms are part of it. But even in our own analysis, we come out that even today, if you look at pharmaceuticals and bankers, they are still part of the superstar in the sense of making much higher return than the cost of capital multiplied by size. So that's the first observation. It has an implication because if you look at pharmaceutical and if you look at banking, I'm afraid to say they are pretty much regulated. The third one is possibly not yet regulated. But again, is regulation the answer? I don't know yet, because it seems that in 2 sectors that are superstar, regulation has been there for quite a while. Second observation, which is an obvious one, power in the power law or curve does not mean something bad. abuse of power is obviously something that you regulate. And again, the proof of that needs to be well investigated with the right tool. Do we have the right tool? I don't know. But at least today, I think it's important to basically make sure that from a fairness point of view, this is still well established that, as far as there's no misbehavior, we should be careful. I will add three other small framing, but I think they're important for the discussion. These platforms are obviously part of what we call the internet. And we made two fatal mistakes when we thought about the internet 25 years or 35 years ago. We thought that internet will be an act of freedom and atomization of firms. What we forgot is that technology is only an enabler, but there are just many other things that you have to add beside technology to make firms, like capabilities and so on, scale, scope. And two, in a world where information start to be much more visible, if somebody can own it to the data, and if there is a network effect, not an atomization effect, obviously the economics are likely to change. And I think we've been caught by surprise with the economics textbook because we made fatal assumptions, which were, the perfect competition. Now, it's not because you fragment that you don't have necessarily a fragmentation. Point number 4, these are high-tech companies. Well, in high-tech companies, if you look at the churn rate of these companies, it's called hyper-competition. So in one way, is hyper-competition a way to manage behavior? Is it enough? I don't know, but I think it's important to get that into context about the churning. I know at my stage, I remember having MySpace instead of Facebook. And I remember, having my own, personal investment in Yahoo versus what happened to be Google. And the last thing I want to finish on the framing, because it's an important one. We talk about platforms, but there is another term that a lot of people are using, which is not the same, but embrace the word of platform. When you have a platforms, you have obviously multi-sided markets, and you got ecosystem. And in the ecosystem, one thing that people keep missing is that using the ecosystem, usually for companies using this platform, is actually as profitable, if not better profitable than being outside of this world. So again, we need to look at the ecosystem dimension within the platform ecosystem to make sure that we got the economics right. I stop here.
Can I take you back to one point you make, which is
Sure.
that we've seen looking backwards that some platforms have failed and others have taken their place. But has that moment passed because of the sheer scale that the Facebooks and Googles have achieved? Because scale becomes inherent to their value.
So
It becomes the barrier to
yeah,
entry.
again, three small points. I think the issue is not the platform. The issue is the digitization, which is that this platform can be obviously much more globalized. But that means an SMB on Facebook can be globalized too. So I think it's important that we look at this from that perspective. Point number 2, those platforms, as a fact of life, again, I'm an economist, I'm an industrial economics, I never look at the full data, but I'm staggered by the fact that if you look at the level of investment of these companies to keep being at the top, it's amazing. I just take a simple example. If you look at AI on mobile, experiments were very clear a few years back that seven times out of 10, Beidou was better than anything Google was doing, even after translated by machine learning the search. Now, they had obviously to catch up and the like, but there is also an investment in that. Now, are we at the tipping point and the like? My sense is that yes, but I see force in both ways. I think the fundamental question to me is not the size. It's obviously a few other aspects that is not linked to platform per se, which are at least something that we should look at. The first is that from a consumer point of view, I love GDPR, for instance, that we push as Europeans. But at the end of the day, any time today that I receive a mail, it's a junk mail of, are you accepting my data? I need to click, and I never read what's happening. So it's actually reinforced the data power of the other guys. So that is something that I need a better regulation for my choice, because today the choice is either you click or you don't have. And on top of that, there are other tons of issues that we haven't talked about, which is not the past, but more important for the future, which is if you look at platform and AI and data, they will embed bias. And the standard of machine learning algorithms and the like themselves, if you take certain type of technologies within that, will allude to certain bias, sometimes not. So we will basically decide on that standardization. That's the scope of major work, which is not regulatory, but also standardization is a scope of what we need to look at.
Casper, you come from the government perspective on the panel. Can you weigh in here?
I can give it a shot at least. It's great that more people came in because there was a very good balance to begin with, almost as many people in the panel as in the audience. So thanks for coming in. Well, I'll give it a shot from a political angle, and to some extent I'll use my own position as the example of where we think the world is changing. I'm a traditional ambassador, but I currently do not deal with countries as much as I deal with the companies. I think the fact that Denmark has taken the decision to appoint an ambassador to technology companies, to technology and digitalization, is a recognition that the world is changing. And I might disagree a little bit with some of the points that other colleagues have said before. I think there are two phenomena that we need to understand better, also from a political point of view, from a regulatory point of view, but also from a governance point of view. And that is, of course, that in technology there is a tendency to winner takes all, which means that some of the platforms, some of the big technology companies have basically acquired dominant positions in their markets. I would actually argue a very, very powerful position. So I think that's one of the areas where today is different than perhaps 20 years ago. The other aspect is, of course, the diversity of these companies. And this is where Denmark believes that, you know, the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks, but also the Baidus and the Alibabas of today are perhaps different than some of the more traditional big multinational companies of the past, because it is very difficult to say whether, you know, Google is an ad company, whether it's an autonomous vehicle company or something else. And why is that important for a country? Well, it is important because new technology and the digital platforms have very little respect for traditional national borders or for sovereignty, if we use that word. And you can choose to sort of pretend that is not the case, or you can try and do what we're trying to do, and that is to say, we don't want to put companies before countries. We want to defend the role of countries. We want to defend the role of governance. We want to have a say in how these companies will be operating in the next decade. The only way by doing that is to engaging with them in a traditional diplomatic conversation, bringing topics to the table that they don't always appreciate. Let me be frank on that. People think it's it's a wonderful sort of sugarcoating of the big tech companies, but when we go and have conversations with my team, it's quite often a very unpleasant experience where we deal with some very, very difficult topics, regulation, GDPR, but also things like online terrorism, illegal content, extremism, etc. And the point here is that I think the honeymoon is over in the tech industry. They have to take a societal responsibility that is proportional to the kind of influence they're exercising. And that is one of the things that we're trying to do from our side.
Nicholas, you've spent a lot of time thinking about the changing structure of the economy around tech. Can you weigh in from that perspective?
Sure. So the way I usually reflect on all that is by going back to the root of this new phenomenon that we call the digital economy. And that's the rise of two different sets of technologies, which are computing on one side and networks on the other. And so when you combine the two, so increasing computing power at the individual level and the possibility to connect everyone through networks, you end up with those powerful network effects that make the digital economy so radically different from the old industrial economy to which we were used to in the 20th century. And network effects have tendency to trigger what economists call increasing returns to scale, which entirely explain the fact that when several companies are competing on the same market, one of them at some point, usually for contingent reasons, will start racing ahead, and you cannot catch up on that one, because racing ahead means triggering that exponential growth that is sustained by network effects, supported by network effects. And once you have those network effects kicking in, it's impossible for the challengers to catch up. And so you end up in every sector that is affected by the digital transition with winner-takes-all with a winner-takes-all situation, which is new. we were used to some winner-takes-all situations in certain sectors in the past that existed in in broadcasting, that was mentioned, telecommunications, railroads, railways, maybe airlines to a certain extent, electricity, also banking to a certain extent. And what the regulators did, what governments were used to do in the presence of increasing returns to scale in those particular sectors, was to extract those sectors from the general rule and design a set of specific rules that will apply to this particular sector, usually enforced by a specific regulator. And this is why in a country such as France, you have, well, in the entire European Union, you have telecommunications and postal services that have been extracted from the general framework, legal framework that applies to everyone, and they are subject to a specific framework enforced by a specific regulator that is, in France, it's ARCEP. But there's an equivalent of ARCEP in every European country. And so we're used to dealing with that, like to say, well, if there are increasing returns to scale, then we design a specific regulation. For the rest, it comes with diminishing returns to scale, and we can simply apply antitrust loose rules without going too much into the details. What happens when increasing returns to scale start to appear in every sector? Do you divide the economy into different sectors, each with a specific regulators, or do you realize that it's the entire economy that calls for a new framework? And so this is why antitrust has become so important. It's because it used to be like the regulation in last resort for those sectors without a specific set of regulations. But now antitrust is called upon to solve problems that used to be solved at the scale of a specific sector by a very detailed set of regulations, like the ones we have in electricity or postal services or telecommunications. And so this is a challenge, and it calls for reinventing, revisiting how we think about competition, about consumer surplus, etc. And I think, and the problem we have here to go back to the first part of the discussion is that this is a discussion we could have had in the 20th century between domestic companies and national governments, because most of the economy was divided into domestic markets, and those domestic markets, at least in the West and Japan, were dominated by domestic companies, domestic champions. Today, the problem we have is that most of those markets are dominated by either US companies or to a certain extent by Southeast Asian companies or Chinese companies. And so most governments are irrelevant or are confronted with the impossibility to interact with those companies that are not local, but that are foreign. And so either they don't have the legal means to actually enforce rules onto those companies, or they do, but they see those as foreign companies, and they regulate in what I call bad faith. So if you see a tech company as a foreign company, as a foreign agent that is here to capture value and to extract it from your country to enrich shareholders in another country, you tend to have a bias. You regulate that company not in the interest of growth, jobs, and consumers, but in the interest of preserving the local value and preventing that company from extracting it. And so you end up with this lose-lose situation in which regulation is bad for the local economy, also bad for the company that is regulated, except when it's enforced by governments that are actually relevant, like the US government and the Chinese government, and I don't see any other governments that has the power to regulate in good faith.
I'd love to return to the really important question you're raising about cooperation across states. But you started with something even more provocative, which was that we need to completely reimagine how we think about competition and regulation. Where do we start? What are the principles we start with in that reimagining? And I invite everyone on the panel to either disagree or contribute where you think we should start.
Well, again, I think that from a pure economics point of view, network economics are starting to be well understood, and there are many means to discipline some markets. And I think we should not confuse first the timing and a substance questions. The timing is that in the private world, whatever we define it, the quest for profits means that obviously there will be companies trying to get access for rents. Now, as many companies will try that, obviously that causes competition. And so better competitions leads to restrictions and better management of companies, better management of society and the like. But at a certain point, as we said, in a few cases, you got the problem of that winner's take all. Now, again, the economics of networks, not in a dynamic setting, but in a static setting, is well understood. And there are multiple strategies to weaken a bit of the platform. It's called multi-homing, but again, multi-homing from a consumer side works well if you have alternative. And if you don't have alternative, obviously it's difficult. So I was applauding the fact that even in Europe, we try to get our own niche search engine in one way as an alternative, but are people using it? So yes, the tools are there, but the practical, even of network economics, makes it difficult. And last but not least, I want to pinpoint to a point which is totally forgot. And I understand the size of the companies you mentioned. But again, there are 200 million companies in this world. Okay? And when we do the analysis of digital among even incumbents, what we find is that the top 10% most successful digitally enabled incumbents actually capture in many of the industries between 70 to 80 to 90% of the profits there. So I think it's important that we don't jump the gun on saying, well, look at the big guys to do a case. It's important that whatever ways we look at the stuff, we also look at the subpar, but it's quite big in terms of value pool. It's amazingly much bigger than 10 companies. It's actually larger. And there as well, we see the same economics of success. Links obviously not to network effects. Sometimes it's capabilities, abilities to reinvent yourself, ability to self-cannibalize, but also an important point. And I think today, what we're talking here is the fact that economic tools have not caught up. And I think it's a plea as well. It's time for the OECD, all of ourselves, intellectual, to actually devise at least some of these tools. And experimentation is also one way to get there because we don't know the solution.
Maybe to answer your question, first I would like to make a point that at the OECD we have done a lot of research that show that indeed there is a competition issue somewhere. That means there is a decreasing intensity of competition, and we can show that with the number of startups that are decreasing, especially in the digital sector, with the number of M&Es that is increasing, the startups decreasing, M&Es increasing, especially in the digital sector across digital firms. And at the end, I mean, the best indicator of a potential competition issue is that you have markups that are increasing. And that's the best indicator because it shows that you might have abuse of power. So that's, we do have a special competition concern. We have signs of that, we have indications of that. But what the competition authorities can do, they can, of course, do what they are meant to do and what they are used to do, continue to enforce law against abuse of market dominance, adapting, as I mentioned before, adapting a bit their tools, their analytical capacities to do so with different data, for example, data on quality, etc. And there is one point that is important in terms of merger review. They need to maybe lower or change the thresholds, the type of threshold you use to make sure that you scrutinize mergers. Because when you have mergers with small startups with no revenue or very, very little revenue, I mean, they go under the threshold and they are not scrutinized, so you might need to change that, the criteria for when you do a review. And then you could also do ex post assessment of the mergers to learn from how the markets evolve, etc. And what the competition authorities do more and more is to do market reviews, so that you look at how a specific market works and whether you do have problem where you you need to have specific regulations or not to ensure that you do have effective competition. And we had a lot of examples of these 3 points, like the classical enforcement of against abuse of dominance, these merger reviews and the market reviews. And then once again, maybe I'm repeating myself, but what's important, and you mentioned that both of you, is that the competition authorities, they need to cooperate among themselves, obviously, because the digital markets are not national markets, so it's not the same scale and it's not the same organization. And again, they need to work with consumer protection, because that's the point. It's to protect the consumer and work with data protection authorities also.
So we have the tools.
We have some of the tools. We have new challenges. We need to adapt to change some of the tools. We need to do some new things, and we need definitely to step up significantly the cooperation in all directions. I mean, geographically and with other regulators and authorities.
Asper, you're on the front lines of cooperation, both with companies and with other governments. Can you speak to where that stands and what needs to be done to improve?
Well, I think the first point here is we're not where we need to be. And I've had the pleasure of doing this job less than 2 years. And it's been, how should I put this, a very sobering experience to deal with the big technology companies. We haven't been invited in with open doors in all places. And I'm talking both about American companies, European companies, and even Chinese companies. And I think it shows that we do need to hit sort of the Control-Alt-Delete button in the mindset of some of the big technology companies. Again, going back to the fact that they have to assume a societal responsibility. I think where the debate is going, I point to 2 points here. First is, I think actually the antitrust discussion, the competitiveness discussion has been helpful, including in the US, in getting some of the companies to understand that there are limits to how you operate as a company. And if you go too far, authorities will begin looking at whether there's something you need to do. We leave the antitrust very happily in the hands of the European Commission over here. But I think what you're seeing is also discussion on externalities. When you look at the climate debate or pollution, that's a normal phenomenon. We talk about the externalities involved in specific production pieces. We haven't sort of had that full discussion on technologies and digitalization yet, but I think that will be coming to a theater near you very soon, and we will begin basically quantifying what externalities that we are willing to accept and how we basically tax that. I think there is a fundamental problem that people in governments perhaps see more clearly than people in technology, and that is for governments or for international organizations to regulate, it requires a degree of insight and transparency from the company's side. I think it's very, very difficult. Many of you probably read Mark Zuckerberg's op-ed in Washington Post a few weeks ago, where he advocated for a pivot to privacy, but also basically said we would welcome more regulation. And that's fantastic to see a CEO from a big company arguing that. What I would say representing a government is that it is very, very difficult for us to regulate companies like Facebook or Google or Alibaba and Tencent unless we have insights to how the technology is working, how the algorithms are put together, what kind of decisions are de facto taken. So I think what we are arguing to fast forward to what my job is really all about is to enforce a closer collaboration between the companies and governments, a more trustworthy, a more open, a more transparent collaboration, because we think that's the only way to get it right. And we're always trailing behind on the regulatory front. We don't claim we understand it completely, but we want to work together with the companies, and we think that would actually also benefit the companies to do that. But we're not there yet.
Interesting. It's interesting to me to hear that perspective, because in some ways, where I'm from the United States, the discomfort is these companies being willing to work with governments, particularly, I mean, not even just our government when it comes to someone's phone being unlocked by Apple, or people being terrifically pleased that Apple will not cooperate, but looking at China and Google essentially creating a separate model for search to comply with an authoritarian regime. So that model works for an open liberal society, but can it be universal?
I don't know. It depends on whether governments or countries, regimes, and the companies will play ball, basically. I think this is not a monolithic industry. I think that's important to say. We have companies that are very eager to work together with us, and then we have other companies that are less eager to work with us. But But we're not against big companies. Let me put that out very clearly. You know, we support big companies making a ton of money. What we don't like is, of course, the misuse of dominant positions. That's where the problem might lie. And having that conversation, I think, is going to be important. And we do need to see the companies stepping up to the plate, being a little bit more open and forward-leaning on what they do, how they use their technologies today. And if that works in a way that doesn't create lack of competition, that doesn't create biases, we're all for that. I think there's a bigger geopolitical discussion that we might come back to on how Europe looks, you know, against the Wild West of Silicon Valley and the Wild East of Shenzhen, but we might come back to that later.
Well, actually, I'd love to just jump into it right now because one of the places that Europe has really led is on privacy. And one of the issues we wanted to get to in this discussion is the relationship between competition regulation and privacy regulation. Is that something that's already happening? How do you see that developing, where consumers are first?
So I think the recent discussion that happened in Europe around privacy has been a bit overestimated in its impact because it happened exactly right after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which stunned everyone, especially lawmakers, European lawmakers. And so we had the impression, the false impression, that this entire GDPR work was in reaction to the recent behavior of certain tech companies, which actually wasn't the case. The GDPR had been in the process of designing new regulations for many years, and it was a coincidence that it happened exactly at the time when privacy became the main concern of many people. So what I usually explain, it's also a bit provocative, I'm afraid, but it's that privacy matters for people in high circles, the elite, because those people are used to, first, they're used to not having a private life, of being protective of their private life because they're under the sunlight, everyone cares about them. If you're a politician or a famous CEO or a movie star, well, you really want your privacy. Most ordinary people don't have such concerns. They don't have the impression that everyone's spying on us and want to know more about them. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that people in the elite are used to being served and at a very high quality. They're used to seamless experiences when it comes to buying things, to staying in hotels, to being transported all around the cities. And what collecting personal data makes possible, not only for the elite, but for the majority, is to provide people with a more seamless experience. Because if we know who you are, we can extrapolate what your needs are. We can anticipate those needs with a relevant, personalized offer. Again, when it comes to buying things, buying the right thing at the right time, at the right price, having it delivered to you when you're home or wherever else you want it to be delivered. It's about transporting you from one point to another in the city. And so what I see is that in exchange for personal data, it's not personal data like I have to pay for this service. Personal data is mostly used by tech companies to make the service more customized and more fit for a particular customer need. And so less privacy, in a way, comes with a better life, like a more seamless day-to-day experience using certain services. We were used to being treated in a mass production economy that's so all of us as being the same, like pushing the same products at the standardized price for everyone. And now people are using personal data to make it known that they're all different from one another and they have different needs and they want to be served in a more customized way. And so I think we should assume that people are smarter than they appear, or that we think they are, and that they realize that personal data collection is in exchange for better services, lower prices, shorter delays, and so on. And so people in the elite have a hard time realizing that because they're used to being chauffeured around by, servants. And they don't realize that companies like Amazon, Airbnb, Uber really have an impactful, really make a difference in the majority of people's life.
Can I challenge you on that? And anyone else on the panel? What if that changes and the prices start going up and the options they show you become more limited? And they have such a dominant market position at that point that you don't have other options.
So it's true, but so I work in venture capital, so by definition, I'm an optimist because what I see every day is entrepreneurs launching new ventures that are precisely aiming at competing with those giants, either in a direct way or through the sidelines. Technology, the thing with networks is that it's a very dynamic economy. Like users are in one place one day and they can migrate to another place in an instant. At least the vanguard can migrate and then discover a new service that then becomes mainstream. And you see it happening over the course of like a decade. It happened to Yahoo and it happened to many others. So I think the difference here is that Yahoo was easy to topple, relatively easy to topple, because it was all about intangible assets. It was all about content and advertising, which means that Yahoo didn't have a moat around it to be protected against competition. And it didn't really have a way to retain their users. Whereas a company like Amazon not only has the digital side of their business that is all about intangibles and data, they also have the tangible side, which is like truck fleets, warehouses, hundreds of thousands of employees now. And that's a moat that's very difficult to cross for competitors. And so I think competition authority have to need to start, analyzing those companies as they are. That is a combination of digital and tangible businesses, and realize that digital comes with network effects, winner takes all dynamics, but the tangible part of the business comes with, moats and security and very strong dominant positions. And I don't see that happening. I think, like Jacques mentioned, that network economics is becoming mature and well mastered, but I don't see network economics combined with that strategic analysis of what exactly makes Amazon's competitive advantage.
Yeah, please.
I just want to go back to your question about what are we trying to analyze. So independently of the big guys, again, I'm looking at digital business model. I think, again, one shortcut that we do is that we talk about platforms. As I said, the ecosystem, and that's the top. But today, those platforms are, this business model of platforms themselves have an infrastructure, which is data, and possibly they have an infrastructure, which is intangible, which is the cloud. And so you cannot analyze that in three separate sessions. The three of those things create the business model. And at the end of the day, when we think about new rules for competition, I think that's, again, my plea is that we should do a better job to be much more creative of that. So technology like blockchain, for instance, can obviously disentangle a bit of the data glue. Open data is possibly another way to disentangle that data glue that possibly can make the business model of that three ways slivers association not working as much. So I also believe that today we are victim of our intellect, which is not sufficiently pushed towards what are these new economics stand for and what are the tools to compete, not compete. The second statement I want to make is your point about is privacy linked to competition? Of course it is. In the sense, as I said, privacy is a way to keep privacy is to make sure that we got open data or you're paid for your own data that break down possibly that vertical integration that I was talking about. And two, as you discussed correctly, I like the economics of third-party competition pricing, which is obviously if you can exploit all the demand curve and everybody has a personal price, by definition, you basically take implicitly the consumer surplus. And that's something that we should be careful. Now, does that mean it's wrong? No, it's an efficiency gain in the market that could lead to abuse of monopoly. But again, I think there are a lot of things we can do. If we think about algorithms, nothing to do necessarily with anti-competitive behavior, but the risk is that it leads to collusion. I think there's enough of models saying if you put two AI-based model of algorithms competing, one day they're going to collude actually better than you do and possibly faster than you do, simply because of the replicator of the data. And there's a danger that is happening. So the point here is that we should have tools to obviously look at these algorithms, and why not having an audit service of these algorithms with transparency? But today, these tools are not put in the hands of regulators and governments. I'm not saying we should have it, but again, in a new world, we need new tools. That's the point I want to make.
Yes, I think we have done research at the OECD on this algorithm collusion, and yeah, we show that there is potential for collusion through algorithm, definitely. So it's a hot topic, and we don't know exactly what to do with it. But yes, there is a question there, and just and one point I want to make is that yes, privacy, for example, you could look at potential abuse of dominance using privacy as a dimension of quality, for example. That's in the sense, you should adapt your tools, but you still have tools that work, but provided that you could tackle these new dimensions. And data privacy is a very important, fundamental one. And I agree with what you mentioned, Nicolas, that we should not consider that people are that stupid that they don't realize the trade-off that they do, but we should make sure that they can still do this trade-off constantly or whatever, and we can ensure, and we need to ensure also that these consumer protection agencies or data protection agencies set the basic minimum that you should ensure, and then make sure that you still, for the consumers, have this trade-off.
Casper?
Well, you said before the panel that we needed to disagree a little bit to have the debate going on. Okay. Good. No, a couple of paradoxes, and perhaps just an anecdote from the work that we're doing. If I received $1 for every time a big company had complained about the European Union and the GDPR, I would not be a poorly paid civil servant. I'd be a venture capitalist like my colleague sitting next to me, because they were not very happy about that to begin with. I think the paradox with the General Data Protection Regulation is that as this has been gradually, developed, evolved since we almost on the day a year ago when it was implemented, it has become clearer and clearer that this is primarily a bureaucratic burden for small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, going back to the point you had before. So to some extent, the difficulty here is that our regulation is indirectly supporting some of the bigger platforms because they can make compliant products that are, plug and play, very easy to distribute, not only in Europe, but also on a global level. On the privacy side, I think the tide is turning. I don't completely disagree with you. I think also if you ask people, do you want to give up your personal data to get advantages, have certain privileges, etc., most people would do that. If you look at perception data, it's not only about an elite problem, it's also about a generational issue. Younger people in general are more prone to give up some privacy issues to benefit from the new platforms. What I would say is that I do think that where the big companies are literally shooting themselves in the foot is by having some of the big scandals, Cambridge Analytica, some of the other data leakages we've seen in the last year, that in a very fast way actually alters the perception among ordinary people about what data is. And to be a little bit more frank, it gives data a bad reputation. Now, I represent a country where our population is very forward-leaning, very pro-globalization, very pro-technologies. But every time we see some of these big scandals, people become a little bit more cautious about giving up their data. And I think even today, people don't necessarily read the full text before signing up to something. But I think people are more aware that you are paying a price if you sign up to these platforms, and very often the price is your personal data. So I do think we will see more and more focus on privacy issues. I think we will see companies that will have to adhere to data ethics or privacy issues. And if they don't, I think that's going to be a competitive problem for them, in a similar way as I would argue that we do need emission statements to see companies basically coming clean. Are you pro-democracy or you're not pro-democracy? I think those are aspects that will increasingly become important from a political point of view, but I would also say from a consumer point of view and from a competitive point of view.
So we are seeing a bit of a balkanization around the world around the approach to the internet. I mean, Russia's most recent legislation is at least from my perspective, troubling. Just getting back to the idea of cooperation, when these are global corporations, 10 years ago, this conversation would be about whether Exxon was bigger and stronger than a country. And today, we actually have a question from the audience asking, are some of these companies more powerful than countries? And if so, how can you regulate? And how can you cooperate to the point that you have enough power to effectively regulate? I think so, to start at least.
But I notice it says Klaus, and my name is Casper, so it cannot be towards a question to me. Listen, it's funny, every time I'm in France, I get a lot of questions from journalists. Now you're basically putting companies before countries. You're adding to the problems that we're seeing. And as I said to begin with, what we're trying to do is to some extent defend the role of states and governments by having a dialogue along these lines. What we do need to recognize that in a number of areas, the companies are very powerful. If you take the annual turnover in Apple, that's more or less the same as Denmark's GDP. That says a little bit about the economic power of the company. But what is interesting is not necessarily, the turnover or the value of the stock, but rather whether that role is being transformed into, some sort of influence over policies and over regulations. And I think that's certainly an aspect that we're looking at with interest, and I would probably argue that we are seeing companies playing a role that could resemble what countries have done in the past. We haven't spoken so much about cybersecurity, but that to me is a very obvious example of a policy area where one could actually argue that the private sector have been pushing governments into responding to what is so evidently one of the major threats of today. You see Microsoft moving ahead with a tech accord, even arguing that we need a digital Geneva Convention. You're seeing Siemens coming forward with a trust accord. I mean, I think the issue here is that we are seeing the companies in this area playing a very helpful role, in other areas less so. And again, what is the solution? What is the deduction to that? That is, we need to engage, we need to bring the companies into the equation, we need to hold them responsible and accountable, but it takes two to tango. And again, I think there's a very big responsibility in the C-suite among the big companies, but I would actually also argue that investors will increasingly need to put their money where you see responsibility also in a broader societal sense.
If I may, I think, yes, you're absolutely right. But what is new is also the power of the crowd. So in this digital world, the companies, of course, first they are still subject to national jurisdictions or regional one, and the GDPR discussion is a proof of that. But then, I mean, these big companies, they still need a license to operate, a social license to operate. And I mean, and all these discussions, these debates, these big scandals make them also vulnerable to, to reaction by their consumers that don't want companies to misbehave, whether it's related to tourism, things, or social license to operate vis-a-vis the environment, data protection, etc. So I think yes, they are super mega powerful. The governments, if they are alone, except if they are Chinese or US, maybe very, very weak towards them. First, if the governments coordinates, that's a different proposition. And secondly, I mean, they need this license to operate. And there is really a counterpower there that is important, and that must be considered, and that they do consider increasingly, because they don't have the choice.
Yeah, I would say as well that, so I try to change and say we need to be better in reinventing new tools based on new type of economics, as you mentioned. On the institution part, I want to be slightly provocative as well. If we want more global cooperation, we possibly need different type of global institution. I think, if we look at some of the institutions that we have, they've been there for just after the war for solving certain type of problems. Maybe we obviously we get a few ones. We get internet.org, we got a few like this, But I also believe that in the new design of societies and the like, it's possibly important to think about new type of global organization. I'm not saying that we should change the OECDs. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that possibly the mission statement could be enlarged on some of these aspects. And this aspect is going to be about cybersecurity, will be about AI ethics, will be about many things, because my fear today is not a fear of regulation power. I think what we see today from a social point of view is that, and the change of the data itself, is that privacy is not a question of privacy only. It's a question of what kind of value do you want to have in this new model. And one of the things that we see in the future, and by the way, on the data, one last one point that people keep missing. We know that in the future there will be much more data interfacing in in the Internet of Things without interface with humans. And where is the GDPR of that? It's not existing yet. And I think the consequence of that will create standards that basically we have no control about that, and we don't have the tool. So, and the last point I wanted to make is that why do we believe we need this institution? Is because we have new challenges, exciting challenges, by the way. It's not that it's doom. But also, we are certainly from a social point of view, we all know that the risk of destructuring is quite high. And today, one of the risks that we see much more than anything else is that welfare issue of some people being passed by these technologies. And we have a risk of democracy. So the risk of democracy is not because there is a risk that it will fail, but if politicians basically react short-term on that risk, they will never take the long-term view of the design problem. So we need global institutions that basically decouple the short term from the long term. So today I also believe that on that setting, I think it's very important that we are creative in creating the new type of para stuff for regulation, for tax, for security, for AI ethics, for social and the like. I think it's a new world, but I don't think we have the institution, we have an incumbency problem. We're still running and surfing on the wave of what the world was 40 years ago.
So I think the call for a new global institution takes us to our final sort of round, which is what should we do? And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do that through the lens of the question we didn't get to, which is really what are the implications of this shift in power to traditional territorial and sort of Westphalian sovereignty, and how should we be acting going forward? So you want to start with you, Nicholas?
I usually explain when I'm speaking, addressing audiences on that matter, that you need to go through 3 different stages. The first stage is realize that things are changing in a radical way. And I think we're past that point now in many circles at every level of Western societies. And the OECD has been doing so much work on that. It testifies that it's important. So the second stage is you need to understand what's going on, and the first stage obviously is to act. It's about acting on it. So I'm not sure we're already at the second stage in many respects. I don't see like traditional CEOs, executives in traditional corporations, or policymakers for that matter, understanding what is going on. But that understanding is absolutely critical, because you need to understand what's going on to decide on the strategic positioning of your country, of your national economy in that global economy. And you need to realize that, well, like every paradigm shift in the past, it will redistribute the opportunities and the value between countries. There are certain countries that were on top in the past that will slide down into irrelevancy. And there are other countries that will seize the opportunity of the shift to race ahead and to finally catch up, and then race ahead of more advanced, of what were previously more advanced countries. So if you look at the situation today, you realize that like the US were dominant, and they still have the opportunity to be dominant in the new paradigm. Europe used to be in quite a good position in the past, but it is slowly losing ground because we have failed on a very important front, which is building great tech companies in Europe, rising from Europe to expand on larger markets. And then China is clearly what the US was in the 19th century, which is the developing country that is suddenly seizing the opportunity of a technological shift to catch up and then race ahead. And so we have the impression that the new economy rewards scale, like you need to be a very large country to succeed in this new economy. I don't think it's true. I think a very interesting comparable is the financial services industry, which was, by the way, also powered by computing and networks. And you need to realize that the global financial services industry has been dominated for a very long time by small places. Like, sure, there's the US, but there's also London, and there's Luxembourg, and Hong Kong, and a few others. And so you can position your economy in this global digital economy, not based on your scale, but based on the smartness of your positioning. But that requires understanding what's going on, understanding your own strengths and weaknesses in this new paradigm, and then acting on that. I see some countries doing that quite well, like Estonia, Singapore, Germany to a certain extent, the Nordics as well. And those countries have realized that it's not about scale, it's about positioning. But other countries like France and the UK, since Brexit, have been like completely lost in that discussion.
The first point is that I think the discussion we've had today and the trends that we are seeing, that will continue, and it will probably get better or worse depending on where you stand. I mean, companies will become increasingly digitalized. Technology will play a bigger and bigger role in the private sector, but I would also argue in the public sector, we need to look at technology not on the fringes of foreign and security policy, but at the very core. It will change international relations. We haven't talked too much about the potential of a digital divide that you mentioned, but I think that's going to be one of the major challenges internationally in the next couple of years. So what do we do about it? I think there is one very important point here, that is, in the digital age, we need more international collaboration, not less international collaboration. But the other point here is that we need more multi-stakeholder institutional setups. I understand where you're coming from, being a diplomat and a civil servant. I would probably say a wonderful idea, a little bit more difficult to implement in practice. But I think the point is valid. And to some extent, my job is a recognition that the world is changing and that we need to approach it in a slightly different way that we've been doing in the last 40, 50 years or so. So we need to invent more multi-stakeholder discussions, forums, institutions. I think what you're doing here at the OECD is a good example of bringing the private sector into the equation. That's going to be important. What my job is about is actually to create coalitions, alliances that will bandwagon around what we think is critically important, which is responsibility, it's democracy, it's human rights. So I think the big question here is, and I think where the big crunch will come in the next couple of years, is two different approaches to technology. One being pro-democracy, pro-human rights, the other one utilizing an approach that has more to do with control and surveillance. And I think companies will have to choose between those two directions. And I think consumers, governments, and interestingly enough, also employees will begin judging the companies on whether they do that. We've seen walkouts in Silicon Valley. I think all of that combined is a very helpful peer pressure to make sure that companies today take a responsibility similar to what more traditional old school companies have been doing increasingly on climate change, on migration issues, etc. So in other words, we need more tech ambassadors. This is the solution to everything, more tech ambassadors.
Okay.
If I may, maybe I will defend a little bit the institutions that you were referring to and how we need to evolve. And that's clearly we need to evolve. And I think that's what we are doing. Because one important dimension, in addition to what you mentioned in terms of multi-stakeholder discussion, we need to join the dots between different policy areas. We used to work more or less in silos. And now, I mean, to tackle these digital challenges, we need to have this discussion with competition authorities, data protection authorities, consumer protection authorities, the task guys, what we do at the Global Forum, etc. And that's what we're trying to do at the OECD with our Going Digital, initiative, try to join the dots between all these different policy communities to see how what's happening in one dimension is impacting on the other. So that we are trying to do so. We are also trying to have more dialogue with the private sector for obvious reasons, as you mentioned, and also to tackle at the same time the social dimension of all these challenges, the digital divide. So that's what is difficult in terms of what you were mentioning, Nicola, being sure where we are, understanding what is our position. I mean, you need to tackle all these issue challenges together. The task aspect, the social aspect, inequality aspect, the more like technical regulatory discussions that we might have, etc. So yes, we are trying to evolve as an OECD, and our business plan is to coordinate policy making. So we might need also to enlarge a bit to have all the relevant actors at the table, which might not be the case currently, but we are, so that's a coordination challenge, and that's what we are. I mean, the OECD was founded to coordinate policies, and we need to do it slightly differently to enlarge the people or the type of actors we have around the table, and to increase the intensity of this across silos discussion. So,
well, I think the good news is that I was a debate on the future of work. I see how much work we still have to do in terms of thinking proactively and all these things. So that's one thing. Now, on the technology, I think I came back to a very simple statement, but I think a statement is difficult to not say during this conversation, which is technology is neither good nor bad, is the way we use it. And at the end of the day, this is about human behavior more than anything else. That's what we should look at that. And whether technology is called the internet or something else, and it's outside of technology, there could be a lot of misbehavior. So we need to fix that. Last but not least, I think it's important, even on the ecosystem of sovereignty, I think we made a very important point, which is let's not confuse economy of scale versus economics of networks. Economies of scale leads to this intuition that, big is too big to fail and too big to be regulated. I don't think that's the way to look at that, because it's actually about network effect. And in network, the positioning is not to be big, is to be at the right node. And if you're on the top of the node and you have the best node and you are the central node of an ecosystem, you make much better view. And it's an interesting thing. When we look at the data flow, and we have been looking at that for 5-10 years now in quite granular way, here's a striking thing. Who do you think is today at the central node of the global data flows? Well, it used to be the UK. If you look at Europe, it shifted a bit to Scandinavia. Now there is one country which is ahead of all of them. It's called the Netherlands, because the Netherlands obviously have created an interesting cloud infrastructure since a long time in the B2B space, with a lot of multinationals where there's a lot of flows coming out. And today, they beat the hell of pretty much everyone in terms of density. Now, if you do the same analysis in Asia, it's not China. We get a biased view of China because we think about, again, like in the US, of 5 big cities or 10 big cities. The one which is the more dense is Singapore, and then Hong Kong. And again, that means small can be beautiful if you have the proactive strategy of the sovereignty there. And I think the point you made is exactly true. In a world where things change, some people go up, some people go down, you get different type of balance of influence. I didn't say power, balance of influence. And at the end of the day, that's something that we should also remind. Networks is also about being at the right core. And in Europe, to be honest, we were at the beginning at the level of the core because the internet was not mature. With time passes, we see all Europe going down. So yes, we see China coming. We see obviously the US coming. So there is time for change as well at Europe level as well.
Great, thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions. I know there are several very interesting questions on the audience that I have here, but I'll leave it to you to ask yourselves. If you could just please stand up and introduce yourself when you ask a question. Do we have any people with questions? One in the front row. Is there a microphone? I think the microphone is coming. Just one moment. Slowly. Here it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fascinating
If you could just
discussion.
stand up for the-
I'm sorry.
They've asked that you could stand
You
up.
can. I can obviously stand up. Yeah. Thanks. Sorry. Yeah. So just maybe to put things in perspective, I think it's good to look at the numbers. And the 10% of firms with highest markups have increased their markups by 30% since 2000. So that's the scale of concentration which is going on, by the way. So it's good to keep that in mind. And it has at least partly happened because tech firms and platforms in particular have enjoyed privileged position. In terms of liability, for example, they have enjoyed privileged position. Now, I think privacy shouldn't be underestimated. When you look at the first report of the European Data Protection Authority for the first few months, there were 200,000 complaints, data breach notifications filed. So people are concerned about privacy. But my question is more, do you see the emergence of new business models on the basis of high level of protection? I mean, there are some good examples, of course, but is it reaching already a sufficient scale? And if so, and if not so, then how can we support that development?
No, I think you make an excellent point, which is, information businesses have been there for quite a while. In the past, they made tons of money. If you look at the EBITDA of some of these companies and like, so there is a profit pool for beside the big platforms to actually create new models of being much more clever in terms of data exchange and all these things. Personally, I serve some of these companies. We see that they are looking at that. The interesting thing, if you look at the working hypothesis they have in terms of the future, they have three. The very first one is that they take the assumption that indeed data will not be, a free ride forever. So they look at that. They also think that data cannot be taken as a given. A data has different value depending of who is using it, by when, and so on. So in fact, the contextualization, the timing, and all these things are going to be quite important. And the third thing on the data, which is also quite important, as I said, is obviously, is it only from a consumer point of view, from a business builder point of view, or for something else? Now, when you look at that, the model will scale. I think when we look at the data, we see it's going to be scaling quite significantly. And but at this stage, we don't see a lot yet, except, as I said, the fundamental, not issue, but one of the fundamental issues today, there is a vertical integration between platform, data exchange, and digital infrastructure. And that's something, as I say, that we don't look too much of it. We look from the slice versus the vertical aspect, which allows these companies not necessarily to get the chance to basically explode and create new business models.
Any other questions? We have one back there. The person with the microphone. Oh, we can start here, and if you could just keep your question short, so we have time for one more.
Yeah, so in the United States, Elizabeth Warren has proposed for breaking up Amazon's platform and its physical merchandising businesses into separate entities. And in the United Kingdom, lawmakers have called for breaking up the Big Four auditing businesses from the rest of their business operations. So what are your respective opinions on the applicability and effectiveness of these measures of ensuring competition by breaking down large businesses into increasingly smaller and separate entities?
I can answer that one. I think those are two very different situations. Like the Big Four oligopoly is the result of an extremely tight regulatory framework that imposes a compliance barrier to entry, which makes it effectively very hard for anyone to try to enter that market. So it's a typical case of high regulatory barriers leads to oligopoly, leads to excesses, and then we have to reflect on breaking up that oligopoly. As for Amazon, it's not the regulatory barriers, as mentioned. It's both the investment they made in the tangible part of their business, that the sheer scale of their business and the economies of scale that go with that, and then the network effects on the other side. So I've argued in the Financial Times for not breaking up Amazon, actually in reaction to that proposal by Elizabeth Warren, because what I see is that Amazon, it's still the beginning, it's still day one, as Jeff Bezos has said himself. They're dominating retail, but online retail, they're far from dominating all of retail in the US, let alone in the entire world. Plus, Amazon is interested in new markets that are extremely dominated by predatory rent-seeking companies. Especially, they're interested in healthcare at the moment. And so what I wouldn't like to see is Amazon being broken up, which would prevent them from using their scale and the power of their technology and the network effects at the core of their ecosystem to rein in that extremely backward-looking, rent-seeking industry that is strangling the entire US economy today, that is healthcare. Maybe wait before they break into healthcare and then break them up into Amazon Healthcare on one side and retail on the other.
And we just have 3 more minutes, so if we could have one last question. I think we had a...
Just a question regarding the importance of industrial policy in the new regulation system, because in the US and in China there's a strong industrial policy promoting this industry. For instance, in the US, the promotion of dual technology has led to the creation of some of these giants. And this is something that has to also be taken into account in this new framework, in the new institutional rules, not only privacy and like domestic competition issues, but also industrial policy and the support that governments are giving to these industries?
Yeah, from a conceptual point of view, I'm just going to make 2 points. Technically, I don't think industrial policy is an helping tool, except in a few occasions when there are obviously major externalities. In this case, there are. So yes, I think industrial policy should be thought through. At this stage, I think the framework of that is not necessarily well designed, at least by different sovereign institutions. So I definitely encourage you to continue to think about that. Now, again, the pragmatism is also the same, which is one thing people tend to omit all the time is that what is important in the case of China is that the Chinese government is actually not the deep pocket of investment, but the deep pocket as a customer. They use the technology. And today, if I look at Europe, I always made the point when I'm with some of my colleagues in Europe is to say, if we combine all the public spending we do in Europe and the procurement of it, we're possibly much bigger than the government in China. But it's quite rare to see that from a public procurement point of view, we are the customers of the European technologies. So that's part of the industrial policies that maybe you could start to think. But again, there is always, it's a second best. So whatever you do that, and if you promote bad technology, you can be locked out in the wrong equilibrium. So it's also, you need to be very cautious about industrial policy in general.
I definitely did not think we would wrap up this discussion with a talk about industrial policy. If you'll join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their thoughts in this lively discussion.